Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, episode 102. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to Italy, to the Cinque Terra, Lake Como, and Milan.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh no, 15-hour flight, oh, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. The first news story I have for you today comes from the LA Times, and according to the story, the first space hotel is launching in 5 years. Do you dream about space travel? Well, you can orbit the Earth at 30,000 kilometers an hour and see the sunrise 15 times in one day, all for the low price of $4 million for a 3-night stay. That is per person based on double occupancy. They haven't announced the single supplement for that particular trip. In the second news story, I didn't report on this particular show that Lufthansa is considering an all-bunk bed cabin in economy class. Well, wanting to do them one better, Air New Zealand is considering having an alternative economy class sleeper configuration in sleeping pods. Both of those are very interesting stories, and I'll include links to the articles in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com so you can see the pictures that are associated with the sleeping pods or a bunk bed based cabin. But they're basically trying to figure out how to make people more comfortable on the long haul flights to Europe or to New Zealand. The problem here, of course, gets to be, well, what do you do when somebody wants to work instead of sleep, when they want to sit up and eat a meal, when they want to watch a movie? But you have to give them credit for trying to think outside the box. And then in the strangest story of all, Thai policemen who break rules will be forced to wear hot pink armbands featuring Hello Kitty, the Japanese icon of cute, as a mark of shame. I swear I did not make this up. It's coming from CNN and not from The Onion, and it's coming from August 6th and not April 1st. Police officers caught littering, parking in a prohibited area, or arriving late, among other misdemeanors, will be forced to stay in the division office and wear the armband all day, says Police Colonel Pongpat Chayathan. The officers won't wear the armband in public. The striking armband features Hello Kitty sitting atop 2 hearts. Simple warnings no longer work. The new twist is expected to make them feel guilt and shame and prevent them from repeating the offense, no matter how minor. Over the last 2 episodes, I've been covering a trip to Europe that my family and some friends took here in July. And the first episode, episode 100, we talked about Germany and Switzerland, as well as some basic trip planning. In the second episode, the French Riviera, as well as renting a car and some of the issues regarding that. And then in this particular episode, we're going to talk about Italy. And with the next episode of this show, we'll go back to the regular interview format, because I don't know about you, but frankly, I'm getting tired of hearing myself. Now, as I've mentioned before, this wasn't our first trip to Italy, and so we'd already seen Rome and Siena and Florence and Venice, and so we didn't have to go to the usual first spots you go to. We loved all those places, but we wanted to see some different parts of Italy, and 2 of the places that got on our itinerary very quickly were the Cinque Terra, and Lake Como. But another spot that I personally was interested in seeing was Portofino. And one of the reasons that I was interested in seeing Portofino, which is a very beautiful, romantic honeymoon spot on the Italian Riviera, very picturesque harbor, you've probably seen pictures of it if you've seen pictures from Italy, is that in the place that I work, our largest conference room has a picture that my boss took, who's also a photographer, of Portofino, and it's about an 8-foot picture, and I spend a lot of the time when I'm at work in this particular conference room with this very beautiful picture of Portofino up on the wall here. And so Portofino is between Genova, which is close to France where we were leaving, and the Cinque Terre. And so we decided, at first we were thinking, let's spend a night in Portofino on the way down to the Cinque Terre. And that turned out to be impractical, in part because the hotels were all booked up, and also Portofino, because it is a romantic honeymoon sort of spot with the jet-set crowd, it is very expensive. And so we really just weren't going to be able to find something there. But we still decided that on the way down we would stop in Portofino. And we didn't quite time this correctly. Now, I mentioned on the last couple shows that we were traveling with some friends, Susan and Kevin, and we were also traveling with my daughter Liz and her friend Donna. And Donna and Liz decided that they wanted to stay in France for one more day because we were actually leaving on the 14th of July. And for those of you who know your French history, the 14th of July, Bastille Day. And so they decided they wanted to spend Bastille Day in France, and we were moving on to Italy by this point. So they ended up staying in Nice another day and then seeing Genova for a day, but we drove through there. Unfortunately, this was also a Saturday in the summer, and by the time we got to Genova, we hit bumper-to-bumper traffic for Italians going down to the Italian Riviera on their day off. And so Portofino is a very picturesque town from what I've seen. Now, I've been in Portofino, but I haven't really seen those views, and I'll tell you a little more about that. What they don't show you when they show you that beautiful picture of the harbor is that on the other side of that picture is a line of cars and Vespas and buses that stretches for miles, especially on a weekend day in the summer, because there are lots and lots and lots of people who come to Portofino. And again, it's one of these places that has little tiny beaches, maybe 10 feet wide, just packed with people all along this craggy coast, and Vespas parked everywhere. It was one of those places that I wasn't sure that if we'd been driving a Vespa, we would have been able to find a place to park. It was that crowded while we were there. We, as I mentioned previously, were driving a minivan because there were 6 of us, at least at times. And there certainly wasn't any place to drive a minivan, so although I drove all the way to Portofino, we didn't actually find any place to park because we arrived midday. We're in this large, more American-sized car. And so I've seen Portofino, but I haven't seen Portofino, if you understand what I'm saying. And to truly understand this, you have to picture me driving with my wheels up on the curb about halfway up the sidewalk so that I can pass a bus around one of these tight corners. Then you've got a correct mental picture of this. And I bring this up because this is one of the things that I think makes the Cinque Terre such an attractive place to go. Is the Cinque Terre is a national park in Italy, and it is a series of 5 villages that hug the cliffs on the coast just south of Portofino, but they are closed to cars. And so if you get there, you have to get there by train or by boat. And so you'll still find some crowds, but it'll be a very different, cut-off kind of way. And I think that was part of the attraction of the Cinque Terre. Now, the Cinque Terre does have small hotels in the cities, not large hotels, not luxury hotels, but even the small hotels were booked up. We didn't book quite far enough in advance, but it's not that hard to see the Cinque Terre because you can stay just a little further out. You can stay even in Genova, or as we did in the southern end in La Spezia, and take the train into the Cinque Terre. And so that's what we did. We actually drove down once we left Portofino, had lunch at a town just south of Portofino, and then drove down to La Spezia. Now, in our quest to stay in what seemed like a different kind of hotel every night, we stayed in a little hotel in La Spezia, Il Centro Hotel, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, which was a very tiny hotel. It had, I think, 5 or 6 rooms, and yet it was a very new hotel, had only a second floor, had bathrooms down the hall, which was odd in a new hotel, but very large, spacious rooms that would have been big enough to put a bathroom in. So kind of an interesting combination, but it was relatively inexpensive, about €100 a night for 4 people, or €25 per person per night, without breakfast included. One of the interesting things about this hotel is because it's such a small hotel, the person who is the front door manager doesn't stay there all the time, and so when we first got there, the front door is locked, and there's a cell phone number on the door, which brings me to something that I've been putting off talking about, which is we did on this trip decide that we wanted to have 2 cell phones because, as I mentioned, Liz and her friend Donna were going to be traveling separate from us at times, and this is the first time she's traveled separate from us, and so we thought, well, it's going to be a little more expensive, but let's go and get a cell phone for each of us so that we can stay in touch as we're trying to connect up again. And that proved to be very useful. And there are a number of different options in terms of getting cell phones, and I researched it somewhat before the trip, but actually had gotten a little busy with the show, and so I didn't get around to doing what I wanted to do. Lots of different options, like buying a cell phone, like getting different chips for the cell phone that I have so that I could use it, or obviously I could use my current cell phone and turn on an international roaming, but then every call would be an international call, even if I'm calling down the street. Some disadvantages to having a cell phone on this particular trip is that we were going to 4 different countries. And because when you get a cell phone, it is linked to one country, many of our calls were going to be international calls, at least within Europe. And I think that my personal option that looked like it was going to save us the most money was actually going out and buying a European cell phone and just turning it on for the certain minutes that we needed. But I didn't get around to doing that. And I'll put a link in the show notes to a couple different articles about choosing a cell phone plan that makes sense for you in Europe if you want to do that. We went with a company called Rent-A-Cell, and I'll tell you the good parts and the bad parts. And the good parts are really good and the bad parts are really bad. And the good parts are that when we got to Frankfurt, we said to the person at the rental car company, we're looking for a cell phone, and he called up the Rent-A-Cell local person. She said, well, you're still going to be at the airport in a few minutes. I'm dealing with something else. And we said yes. So she drove over to the airport, brought 2 cell phones. They, had been used before. It didn't matter. They were going to work fine, as well as a package that had the charger in it, as well as UPS bags. And the idea is that you use it whenever you're done with it. It doesn't have to be the whole length of your trip. You drop it in a UPS bag, call her up and say it's at such and such hotel. She arranges pickup, and the cell phones go back to her. So that is all very convenient and all worked very well. So having the cell phone worked well, picking it up and returning it also worked very easily. The chargers, no problems there. The problem gets to be that when we get home, we get a bill, and basically so far we've been billed $2,800 for the cell phones. Seems a bit excessive. At least $2,000 of that looks like they are deposits that we are supposed to get back. But it's been a month since we have gone, and although I'm communicating with the customer support, they're saying, well, you should have gotten it by now, and I haven't gotten it. So that's not good. And then I still haven't seen an itemized bill of the calls, and that bill seems way higher than I was expecting, and so I'm still looking for an itemized list that said, this is the call, and this is how much it costs. So that part is a little bit cell phone hell. Quite enough money that I could have bought myself a new iPhone if I hadn't done this. So learn from my mistake and check out the articles on other different ways that you can get cell phone coverage if you want to do that when you're in Europe. So we got up the next morning to go find a place for coffee and some rolls or whatever, and we're trying to get to the boat to the Cinque Terra. And so we're a little bit of a hurry, but we found a little coffee place, an internet cafe that was open, that wasn't too far away. It's Sunday morning, so we weren't quite sure what we would find. One of the things, though, that is just kind of an interesting window onto Italian culture is what we couldn't get coffee to go. Now, granted, my Italian isn't that great, and I hadn't brushed up on it before this trip. Io parlo italiano non molto bene. I don't speak Italian very well. But with Italian and English and charades and a little Spanish, para llevar, I'd like to go, we couldn't get the coffee to go. Now, I don't think they had to-go cups, and I think the whole concept of I'd like to take my coffee and not sit down and relax and enjoy it was just a very foreign concept. This wasn't a tourist area. This wasn't a tourist cafe. And at some point, the light dawns on her, and we think, oh, she knows what she's doing. And then she pulls out ceramic cups, and we realize we didn't get it across. And we got it on the porch instead of getting coffee inside, because that was just the whole concept of I want my coffee and to eat on the run was just a foreign concept. This is Italy. This is la dolce vita. This is the good life. And you just don't rush the good things like your morning cappuccino. Now, in a strange parallel universe, also in Italy, on the autostrada, when we were in Italy going on the way to France, we saw little tiny cappuccino packets, about the size of what we would consider a jam packet in the U.S. that you'd get at a diner or an IHOP or something like that. And it had cappuccino in it, and you could put on a little tiny straw, just a little tiny thing, and have your morning jolt of espresso. I say cappuccino is a little tiny packets of espresso that you could get in bulk at the autostrada's little stores. Now, my Italian did prove to be useful enough at least to get us directions to the boat. We found the boat, and we went to get on the boat. And one thing I should mention, even though we have this laid-back culture about having your morning cappuccino, the way that the Italians line up for getting on something like this boat is a little bit like a rugby scrum. It's a very disorganized, push your way forward kind of way. And I didn't think this boat was going to be able to hold that many people, but it was fairly packed as it left La Spezia. But it basically was stopping at a beach before it got to the Cinque Terra, and a lot of the Italians were getting off and just going to a local beach and enjoying their Sunday afternoon. So the Cinque Terra is, as I said, 5 villages, and they are from, and I'm going to do them from south to north because that's the order that we did them, Riomaggiore, Manarola, Corniglia, Vernazza, and Monterossa al Mare. And so we took the boat past this beach and past some of the other towns here because there's a point of land that sticks out between La Spezia and the Cinque Terre, and also an island down there, which is where the beach was. And so you pass some very pretty towns before you even get to the Cinque Terre, like Porto Venere. But Porto Venere you can still drive to, and so when you finally get up to Riomaggiore, the road is closed for this Italian national park. And when we got off the boat at Riomaggiore, we got off with a large Italian group that was touring things. And the way it works with the Cinque Terre is you can walk in between the villages, or you can take the train in between the villages. And so you have these very pretty little villages, shops, and obviously places to buy tourist trinkets, and little tiny beaches, and fishing boats pulled up on the city square in some cases, or pulled up on the beach or in the harbor. The towns themselves, these earth tones and umbers and beautiful, not freshly painted, but a little rustic kind of views. But we get off with this large group, and as you go north, if you start in Riomaggiore and you go north, then the first path between Riomaggiore and Manarola is a very easy path. It's something your grandmother could probably do. It's paved the whole way, and this whole group of mostly senior citizen Italians were going with us, and so it was a bit crowded and such. And I'd say probably that first path was the only part that I would say was a little disappointing in terms of the Cinque Terre. One, it was crowded because of the group that we had gotten off the boat with at the same time. 2, because it's easy. A lot of people go there. There's a lot of graffiti and such on the wall that's there. And I guess my expectations from a national park are a little different because we've been to so many national parks in the U.S., and 1 is you just wouldn't see that kind of graffiti, and 2 is national park rangers. We're so used to the national park rangers in the U.S., and of course we're speaking English to them. I haven't tried speaking Italian to U.S. national park rangers, but are so polite and so willing to tell you things and so interesting. And here we found them, at least with the American tourists, to be just a little more curt, a little less, didn't seem like they were enjoying their job quite as much. And so, the first Riomaggiore we get off, it's pretty, we do the hike to Manarola, and it's a little disappointing, but I would say the rest of the trip really lived up to my expectations. So both the towns of Riomaggiore and Manarola, these pretty little towns clutched to the hillside, very picturesque. I hope you, if you're not looking at the iTunes enhanced version and seeing some of the pictures, I hope you check out the gallery that I have of some of the pictures that I took, or go to Flickr and look up the Cinque Terra. And then again, from Manarola to Corniglia, the path gets a little more rough. As you go north, the path gets more and more difficult in between these villages. So Manarola to Corniglia is generally a flat path. It has some rises, a little bit of a hike. It's about a 30-minute walk, maybe. Of course, that was with the crowded trail from Rio Maggiore up to Manarola. And then it's about a 45-minute walk to Corniglia. The path is much more beautiful, I thought, at that point, a little more tricky. There were also places that you could swim. There were places where you could rent kayaks. There was also someone we saw who was swimming from Rio Maggiore up to, he could have swum all the way to Manarola. He swam about halfway there and then went back. An older man who was just out getting his exercise, swimming in the beautiful clear ocean here. So an interesting place. There are little tiny beaches that you have to climb down to the cliffs to get down to there. And then when you get to Corniglia, you have two options. One is you can wait and take the bus, because all of these cities have train stations, and in Corniglia the train station is down at the shore. And then Corniglia itself is up on the top of the hill, and so you can either wait for the bus and take that from the train station up to the top of the hill, or you can do what we do and count the stairs. And it was something like 375 stairs, and it's starting to be a warm morning, so we're starting to get a little exercise here. There was a woman selling some beautiful watercolors on the stairs we thought we'd go back down to, but we didn't actually end up going that way because we didn't end up taking the train, which was our original plan, up to the next town of Vernazza. So we stopped and we had some lunch in Corniglia, caught our breath, filled our water bottles. The one thing that I did appreciate was that there was public water in various places in these towns, because it's starting to be quite a warm day. It's probably about noon at this point in a warm Italian day. And we decided, well, that wasn't that hard. Why don't we just walk the next hour and a half walk to Vernazza? And I'm glad we did, but it was the heat of the day by this point, and we went through our water bottles. I was about halfway through when I just completely drained mine dry, and basically I'm just drenched in sweat by this point. And fortunately we found halfway through there's this little tiny mirage of a bar that sells water at affordable rates, as well as other things, obviously, but that was what I was looking for, that showed up just in time for me to not get heat stroke, probably. One thing I like then about when you're finally doing this hike here from Corniglia to Vernazza is it is less crowded. There aren't that many people on it. You can really appreciate this as a national park and these beautiful vistas of the ocean, and then you come down on Vernazza, and Vernazza is probably my favorite of these 5 towns. And Vernazza is where we came back then for dinner. It's not as large as Monterosa, but there are plenty of restaurants there. It's got a lovely square that opens up right at the water, and the tiny beach and the breakwater that separates it from the sea. And so we stopped in Vernazza, and when I say caught our breath, we had to sit down and just relax for a while and let our bodies cool off a bit, let ourselves dry off a little, maybe get some water, maybe some ice cream, and decided at that point that probably since the next trail from Vernazza to Monterosa is also a long and probably a little more difficult hike, that we would take the train. And so basically it's just a 5-minute short train ride between these towns, and you can take the train from Vernazza to Monterosa as we did. And Monterosa is different. Monterosa feels a lot more like Portofino, and there's 2 different towns in Monterosa basically. And I think they both have different flavors. So when you get off the train and you go out, that's the part that feels like Portofino. Lots of private beach, all the different lounge chairs and beach umbrellas that you can rent, and it looks like that's the only town that's there, but if you look to your left as you're staring at the beach there, you'll see a tunnel, and the tunnel will take you through to the old part of town. And the old part of Monterosa, I think, is much more attractive. And so we went up through the old part of town. There's another beach there in the old part of town, which is where the boat would take you to if you went between these towns by boat. Take a little time to stroll up into the old town and stroll into some of the old lanes there. More picturesque, a little more slowed down, a little less of just a beach town. But still a pretty town, more so I think when you get to the old town. And then we headed back to Vernazza, and it was interesting because when we got back to Vernazza, we got back there about 7 o'clock, and the cafes don't even open up until 7. And so we found a spot at one of the bars right on the water, and pretty much all the day trippers have left. They've gotten on the train and they've gone back to Genova or wherever. And the town has really emptied out by the evening. And then other people will have gone back to their local hotels and they've changed for dinner, changed out of their bikinis and into their dresses for dinner. And the restaurants start to fill up maybe about 8 o'clock or so. But it's just a very different, less crowded, unhurried pace. And just a beautiful city. I look back at my pictures of Vernazza in particular, but of all the towns in the Cinque Terra, and it's tough for me to pick a favorite part from this trip. But from the pictures alone, I would say the beauty of the Cinque Terre is something that really does stand out for me. And I should give credit here that we heard of both the Cinque Terre and Lake Como, our next stop, through Rick Steves' TV program. And I think really Rick Steves put, for American tourists, the Cinque Terre on the map. And so it's not uncommon to see a lot of American tourists carrying around one of his guidebooks in that particular area. So Lake Como is north of Milan, just a very short drive, and it is a wishbone-shaped lake in the southern part of the Italian Alps. And the left part of the wishbone is the town of Lake Como, and then the right bottommost part is the town of Lecco, and then the spot where they join is the picturesque town of Bellagio. And we stayed actually in Verena, which is just up on the right-hand side, not far across the lake from Bellagio. And continue our trend of trying to stay in lots of different types of places, we tried to get into a hotel that Rick Steves recommends in town, and there was a mix-up with the facts, and so they lost it, they felt bad about it, and so they got us into the Hotel Villa Cipresi. And the Villa Cipresi is a little more expensive hotel than some of the ones we've been staying at. We were staying in doubles, and they ranged from 125 to 155 euros per night. So we're up in the 75 euros per person per night, so a more expensive stay. But the Villa Cipresi is a former villa that has been turned into a hotel, a very nice hotel, a 3-star hotel on their rating system. And it has this lovely gardens surrounding it, which is typical of the villas in the area. The villas were often from the rich people in Milan who looked for a place to stay in the summertime when the heat got too bad in Milan, and so they would come up here to Lake Como. And Lake Como is a wonderful retreat here, because remember how warm I said it was in the Cinque Terre and how warm it is in Milan, and a heat wave has really started to hit Italy by this point. And it's still warm up in the Lake Como, but there's a lovely breeze that's coming through, and it just was this idyllic beauty. Now, one of the interesting things about Verena is that you can walk through Verena and go to the town square and see the old church and a couple different cafes there, and go drive through it and not realize that it's a pretty village, not realize it's a pretty town, because much of the beauty of these lakeside towns is visible only from the water. And so Verena, for instance, has a walk that traveled all the way from our hotel, which is at one end of town, that goes down along the lake shore and has a number of different cafes, has the ferry stop, because one of the popular ways of getting around this particular area is to take the ferries across the lake, especially because the lake is long and thin. You can much more quickly take a ferry across to Bellagio than you could to drive there. But that's the part of Verena, for instance, that's very beautiful. But we were in town for a few hours before we even realized, or at least my wife and I realized, that that part existed. We were going through this upper part of town and up more where you would drive through. And so it's just interesting. It's like this veiled woman who's hiding the beauty for the people that she really loves. The next day we took the ferry over to Bellagio. One thing that was really interesting about the ferry is just how efficient it is. When they get the boat docked and they get everybody off, they get them off really quick, and then they get everybody on and they go. And it's just best to know your schedules to be on time for this, although they go fairly frequently, so it's not like you'll have to wait that long for another one. Bellagio is a very beautiful town that starts at the lake like the rest of these towns in the area and then goes up the hill. It has very good shopping, I'm told by the experts that I brought with me. There are some things that you can see in the area. There's a little tourist train, like in so many of these little towns, that will take you off to the other villas. And you can see in one place in town some of the archaeological remains of other villas dating back to the Roman times. So this has been an area that has been enjoyed for some time. Met a history teacher when we were going through here from Arizona. He and his wife have been taking children on tours for some time to various places around the world. And he was telling me that right near Lake Como was where both the Roman road went, as well as where Mussolini was captured and then later tried and executed. And so Bellagio is a place where you can shop, or you can explore the little alleyways, or you can just sit and enjoy the beauty of the lake in one of the cafes that sits along the water. And as long as we're talking Italy and food, I really just should pause here a little bit to talk about food in Italy. I think you know what Italian food is probably like. You know your pizzas and your pastas and such. The one thing that I do really enjoy about Italy is it is not hard to find a good meal in Italy. It's not hard to find enough food. In fact, it's easy to find too much food. And it's not hard to find good food. There is a love for life for Italy that is centered or lit a little bit around eating. We couldn't help but notice that most of the older generation in Italy, those who were maybe a generation older than me, looked like they had been doing a fair amount of eating. The prices for the food were a little cheaper than we found in France, which was cheaper than Switzerland, although you're more likely, especially in spots like the Cinque Terra or in Lake Como, but even in some of the other spots, to have a cover charge on the bill for the use of the table for the evening. I also want to comment a bit about Italian fashion. My wife noted that in France, if someone was to have a plunging neckline, it would be the women. In Italy, it would be the man. We also did stop in Menaggio. We didn't find quite as much to do in the town of Menaggio as we did in Bellagio, but there are a number of things to do outside, and so I'll put a link in the show notes to the official Menaggio site, which includes things like hikes that you can take and mountain biking and that sort of activity. There are a number of other things to do in the area. There are other villas that you might be interested in if you're a movie buff, like the Villa Balbianello, which is better known to fans of Star Wars as Queen Amidala's Palace in Episode 2, and that is located near Lecco. We also went the next day to Como. Como is at the bottom of the left half of the lake. We took the funicular up to the top of the hill and got a view of Como. In addition to the regular ferries which go out of Como, you can also take the high-speed or the hydrofoil ferries, which will take you the whole length of the lake if you have some time and you want to do that. There's a memorial that I appreciated in Como to the people who died under fascism in World War II, and it is just the various letters that they wrote and the words that they expressed, including Anne Frank, but also including other people who died in various places because they were resisting fascism. So it's a very striking memorial in the park just to the left of the lakefront there. Como also has a cathedral, and so you can check out the cathedral in Como, the Duomo in Como. And then the last stop on this particular trip was Milan, and we didn't really go to Milan this time except to stay at the hotel there because we had been there before, as I mentioned. We stayed at the Hotel Vienna, and I only bring up the Hotel Vienna because, let it be a lesson to all of us, the Hotel Vienna is a lower-priced hotel, and so it was something like 30 euros per person for the one night. We had 3 double rooms, and it wasn't a very good hotel. When I say it wasn't a very good hotel, we got in there and it was really beastly hot by this point, and the air conditioning didn't work in any of the 3 rooms we were in. And oh, by the way, if you booked through an online travel site, air conditioning is extra. It's not included in the room, and so we were able to shift 4 of us into rooms that had air conditioning, but the girls were still in a room that had no air conditioning, and so was quite hot. And also the internet was free, except that it didn't work in every room, and at 10 o'clock they turned off the machine that did the internet and didn't really want to turn it back on. And the person who was at the front desk didn't really speak English very well and was difficult to communicate. And the breakfast was pretty sad. And when we got back, we checked out the reviews online, and all of those problems have been listed by people in not only in English, but we could find people making the same complaints in French and Italian and German. And so really what we hadn't done is we hadn't done our homework for that particular hotel. And so do remember to check out hotel review sites. They can help you to avoid the kind of experience that we had there. If you do have more time and you want to do more in Milan, then I would certainly recommend the Last Supper, which is in Milan, but you do need to book weeks ahead of time sometimes if you're there in the summer. The Duomo, obviously, and then right next to Duomo, one of the original shopping malls there, which is the Mall Victor Emmanuel, which is a very Victorian-style iron and glass monument to shopping, is the best that I can come up with there. Milan is, of course, known for its fashion, and that's why a lot of people really enjoy going to Milan. With that, we'll bring the story of this particular trip to a close. And I thank you for indulging me. And as I say, next week we'll plan on getting back to interviews on other different locations so that I can hear somebody else's voice for a change. I have two resources for you today in the Internet Resources portion of this show. The first one is a link to Smarter Travel, which had an article called The Secret Side of the Cinque Terra. So if you're interested in more information about the Cinque Terra, which we talked about today, check out that article. And then I'll also put a link in the show notes to an article from Mashable, which lists 75 plus online travel resources. So it lists everything from fare finders and search engines to social networks about travel, travel guides, tips, and advice. So check out that compendium of information at Mashable. Links to both of those in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com or in the iTunes enhanced version of the show. I exchanged emails this week with Clint, who's planning a trip to New York City, and I put him in touch with Rob from the New York Minute Show, who could tell him about things to see in New York. And Clint also mentioned he might be doing a travel podcast in the future, and to encourage him, I'm playing a promo here from a friend of mine.
This is Ed Vodder, host of Searching the Internet, a show about finding the information you need on the web. The podcast can be found at www.qdinformation.com/searching. And right now you're listening to one of my favorite podcasts, Amateur Traveler, with Chris Christensen. And now, back to your regularly scheduled podcast.
So, Clint, if you do a show, maybe I'll play your promo here on the Amateur Traveler. And with that, we'll bring this show to a close. If you have any comments for me, send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com or call the new comment line, 408-8494-POD. That's 408-8494-763. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest, served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, Podshow and Limelight.